Hello, everybody, and welcome on the State of Web Component. It is a fantastic pleasure to have you around and also being the host of this great event. Today, we're actually sponsored by CircleCI, but before we go into sponsor, let me talk to you and tell you something about this dot first. This dot labs provides architectural guidance, staff augmentation, and on-demand subject matter experts, temporary CTO, one-on-one pairing, and mentorship. So we are everywhere and anywhere. Just to let you know, we are also currently hiring. But if you want to know anything else about this dot, just visit our website on thisdot.co. And if you are actually want to see our job page, just go to thisdot.co/jobs. Again, a big thank you to our sponsor, that is CircleCI. CircleCI is the CI/CD platform built for modern engineering teams. Thank you again, CircleCI, for sponsoring. Before we move on, I also want to share all the different upcoming events that we have. So we have a very busy schedule ahead, very busy summer. So first and foremost, we have the React Office Hour. So whether you're just starting out or you're a React wizard, come and chat with us about everything React. And Dustin Goodman is going to be the host on that event. Then we go Vue Office Hours. Whether you're just starting again or you're moving from Vue 2 to Vue 3 or anything you want to chat about Vue ecosystem, more than happy to for you to join. I'm going to be the host there. Love you. Love to talk about everybody on Vue-related subjects. And then we have the Women's in Tech. This month, Women's in Tech is going to be, we're going to have Abby Perini to join and discuss about coding with ADHD. So all women's welcome in a fantastic event. So just go on the website, take a screenshot, and sign up for the Women in Tech. Last but not least, we have another state of event, and is a state of Meta Framework. So join us for an enlightening panel discussion on the ever-evolving state of Meta Framework in the digital landscape. So what are you waiting for? Just screenshot it, sign up to all these events, and come around. You didn't come here for the event, you came here for actually us. 100% they came here for the host. So I'm Simone Cuomo. I'm a software architect at this dot, and you can find me on Twitter using the hashtag Zelit880. And with me is Nacho.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ignacio Falk. I'm a senior software engineer at this dot. And you can find me at Twitter as FlacoLeFluke. And I'm very excited to be here today.
Okay. Unfortunately, people don't actually join this event for us. They joined this event for the panelists. So let me add the panelists back and ask them to actually introduce themselves. So let's send them all in. Here we are. So starting from the left to the right, Justin, introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name's Justin Fignani. I am a software engineer at Google. I've been working on web components for a long time, back in the Polymer days, if people are familiar with that. And then we created a new version of kind of our web components library called Lit, which I've been leading for the past, I don't know now, 5 or 6 years or so. So I work on the Lit library, and then I also have been, here and there working on proposals and web component standards. That's me.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the intro. Next one up is Zach.
Hey, I'm Zach Leatherman. I am a staff engineer at Netlify, and I built the 11D static site generator, which the Lit library graciously uses for their website, I believe. And also, most recently, I've developed a sort of a templating language for web components called WebC. So, that's me.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the intro. Next one up is Christopher.
Hi, I'm Christopher Joseph. I'm a co-founder at Begin, and I was the co-author of Enhance, which is a framework that uses server-side rendering of custom elements. So I've been playing with web components on real production websites for years now. That's how I fit in here.
That's experience that we need on this panel. And last but not least, we got Rob.
Hey everyone, I'm Rob Eisenberg. I got my start with web components, probably experimenting around late 2013. And back in 2020, I joined Microsoft and spent about 3 years building the foundation for Microsoft's web component technical strategy, which was a really amazing experience. And we shipped web components to over 1 billion customers and had adoption over about 1,500 projects and teams. These days, I'm working as Chief Software Architect at Bluespire, and I'm focusing on web standards, UI architecture, and engineering culture.
It's amazing. So great panelists to have. I don't think people want to see a slide, so I'm going to remove the slides away and just focus on the people. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining. So if it's the first time for you to actually join this event, if it's the first time for you to actually joining one of the state of, there's no actual agenda, there's no slides going to be shared. We're really just going to ask questions to each other, and we see where the conversation goes. This is a great forum for people in the industries, such as Justin, Zach, Christopher, and Rob, to find discussion and add sometimes agreement on things that are sometimes asynchronous. You also have a chance, if you want, to actually ask questions. So feel free to use the comments. You add questions. If we do have time and if a question fit the discussion, I'm more than happy to ask the question to all the panelists. So I usually like to start it with the state of by going around the room, getting a little feel. Okay. And the first question that I'm going to ask is, how are you feeling about state web components? So we do this every now and then, every quarter, I think. So really share your thoughts of how you're feeling about web components. So some of you have been here for quite a few years. So how are you feeling about web components right now? What do you want to tell our listeners? And I'm going to go with Christopher first. Because you're on top of my screen.
I feel that if you're not using web components in 2023, you run a real risk of becoming obsolete, and your current skills might not be that useful in the near future. It's never been more exciting. The final specs are landing. And I know it's been a while, and web components have been around for a bit, and we keep promising that it's soon, but it really is imminent.
Amazing. Justin, you go next.
Yeah, I mean, I think things are in a really good spot right now. I'm quite encouraged by what's happening on the standards side and the engagement from all the browser vendors in a kind of more equal way than it has sometimes been in the past. I think we're seeing some of the last few kind of issues with Shadow DOM being kind of figured out. Apple helped get streaming declarative Shadow DOM. Over the finish line there when we thought we weren't going to be able to do streaming. So seeing a huge contribution from them is great. And yeah, just going to the standards meetings, I think that I'm just really encouraged by how bought in and the kind of long-term thinking the browser vendors are being here, where, I think that for all various reasons, there's kind of controversies around the web components area. And I think that just doesn't really, kind of affect the thinking of the browser vendors who are trying to add like a useful platform primitive here. So I see continued investment there, which I think is the most important part, because that stuff is stable and durable. And once you have that, any number of user land libraries can use it. So I think we're about to get some good things landing here in the next this year in Chrome and Safari. And yeah, it's looking good.
That's amazing. That's what we want to hear. Next one is Zach.
Yeah, I think web components are great. I really have kind of over the years sort of preached about shipping as little JavaScript to the client as possible, and I think we're starting to see more APIs in the web component space that help facilitate that use case. And so, yeah, I've been really excited about declarative Shadow DOM. I think that's a great thing to ship. I hope Firefox also includes it soon. And yeah, I think the big risk right now is maybe browser investment and sort of buying in to things across the ecosystem. So yeah, I'm really excited about web components. I think that getting as close to the platform as possible is a great thing. And if web developers realize that they can use these lower level tools to accomplish their tasks without needing heavy libraries or frameworks, I think the web's going to be better for it. So yeah, I'm all in on Team Web Components for sure.
That's amazing. And last but not least, Rob.
Yeah, I had a really unique experience of happening to join Microsoft right at the time when they were about to ship the Chromium-based Edge browser, and that was they shipped that in January 2020, and that was really the browser that was the last holdout on a lot of the core web component features. And what was neat about just that changeover is how it changed the conversations that were happening entirely within the company about what could be done, what was possible now. And that really unlocked a lot of things. And that was 3 years ago now, and there's been really good adoption, I think, across the industry. So I think that fundamental milestone of having the core specs available in every major browser really unlocked a lot of things. And since then, the number of features sort of under the web components banner has doubled. Really, there's been that wasn't just a stopping point, right? That was just a place along the way. And so a lot more work has happened. And by the way, shout out to Justin, because he's been super awesome in his work on standards and whatnot. And also agree with Justin too, the interaction with the implementers has been really good, especially I would say over the last year. Safari really stepped it up, and seeing that the browser implementers have a deep interest in helping to address this area of the web, that's made a huge difference in the community. I think adoption across the industry, there's been a lot of community interest. All these things to me, just convey a message of, hey, we're in a really good spot here. We're not done. We're never done with the web, really, but we're in a healthy place with web components, and we've got a good momentum behind it, and we've got, I think, a good assessment of, what we need to do still and the direction that we need to go. And a lot of people are working together on that. So I'm very, very positive on the landscape.
I think Justin just mentioned declarative Shadow DOM being supported by Safari, and you, Rob, also mentioned like Chromium being adopted, being used now by Edge. What roles do you think like browsers have in adoption? How do they affect adoption of web components? Because there's been a long time since, I guess, Chrome or Chromium started supporting declarative Shadow DOM, and now Safari. I think it's some years probably of difference, and it's a long process to have new features from being discussed to being like accepted and then implemented in browsers. So do you think browsers play like a big role when we talk about adoptions? Because as a developer, you're usually worried about where is it supported? Is it supported everywhere, or do you have to write something different to support other browsers? How do you feel about the browser's role in the web components adoption? This is a question for everyone, of course.
Well, we really need a lot more involvement from all of the browsers, honestly, if this is going to progress the way that we see it. I think the web component specs the way they're written are brilliant, right? Because then little pieces can go in over time. You don't have to adopt them in their entirety, right? And I think that's actually also one of the downsides to the web component spec, right? Because people look at it like, oh, I need all these to be available in order to use them today, but it's really not true, right? We didn't need declarative Shadow DOM. I mean, honestly, every website since the beginning of time has been written with the light DOM, right? Shadow DOM's a new thing, right? It doesn't mean that every website on the web is broken. It just means that we now have a new tool once this declarative Shadow DOM lands to use to add more encapsulation and add on top, right? So it's another step in progressive enhancement the way I see it, right? So we do need all of the browsers to be involved, but I think we can do a better job of talking about it around the adoption part, right? We don't need all of the parts for adoption. We just need people to understand what's going on in the spec process better.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of like variables that affect how a particular feature might be adopted, and whether or not the browser is kind of the gatekeeper there or not. Some things can be polyfilled or kind of emulated very easily. And so libraries can help kind of, give the developer that feature or something that looks like that feature like ahead of time, and then it just seamlessly switches, like adopted style sheets. Lit and probably other libraries have a thing where like it'll inject, whatever styles you write in your component into the Shadow DOM with a style tag if there isn't adopted style sheets, and if there is adopted style sheets, it'll use that API. So as soon as the browser ships, like the adoption takes off on that feature. Shadow DOM was very difficult because it's hard to polyfill, but we're kind of past that point now. Some things are like critical, like you just can't do it without the browser. I don't know if people are aware of the composed selection API, which is a standard way to get the current user selection through shadow roots. And this is totally needed for like any kind of rich text editor, like Slate or Quill, Prosemirror, things like that. And so like you just couldn't write the cross-platform code to get the current selection. So you couldn't make like nice encapsulated Shadow DOM using web components for those types of editors. And so, hopefully like that ships and adoption will take off quickly. Declarative Shadow DOM is a whole nother ballgame though, right? Because it's not like the browser adds support for that and then all of a sudden it starts getting used. Like the server side needs to come along too. And that's been a tricky thing because there is no like DOM standard or whatever on the server. So there's no like, well, you're using your web component and it'll just automatically do some declarative Shadow DOM thing. Like each framework needs to build their version of the server side component to utilize that. So I think that's that, and the fact that like the browser support wasn't there across all the browsers has definitely made that take longer. But hopefully we'll see that pick up as you actually get Zero.js ability in all the browsers and the frameworks start shipping their server-side components.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on the subject of implementers. I think, I've been in and out of the standards process in various capacities over the years, and I've really been trying to dig in a little bit more lately. And it's interesting to consider all the different aspects of what goes into, getting something into, say, the developer's hands to actually use. And we forget about the fact that, well, first we actually have to agree that there's a need. Then we have to agree on what the best solution for that is. And across a wide variety of people with different backgrounds, different experiences. Not everybody is a JavaScript person, Some people are focused on content. Some people are focused on apps. And so you've got to identify the needs. You've got to get a consensus. Then you have to convince the browser implementers that it's worth them doing something about, right? Because that's not always obvious as well, especially if there are maybe JavaScript solutions for the equivalent. And then once you convince them that it's really worth them doing something about, and you get all this consensus and agreement, well, we can't forget that, the browsers are all built by companies that are running a business, and there's millions of dollars of engineering investment that goes into this. And so there's a very real aspect of this is, do we have engineering capacity? How does this align with our business goals, right? If I'm Apple trying to decide whether, and I'm an engineer on Apple, say, for example, and I really am behind streaming declarative Shadow DOM, I still sort of have to justify it from a business perspective internally that it's going to be valuable to us as Apple, if you will, to go spend X amount of dollars and time to go implement that. So there's all these different angles that kind of play into this process. And a lot of it is the human part of the process, really, is getting agreement, understanding things, helping the implementers understand things. Implementers, remember, most of the time they're working in C++. They're not working in HTML and JavaScript and CSS all day long like many of us are. They're spending more of their time in C++ land. They're spending more of their time in spec land. And so we have to do the work to bridge the gap, get the understanding, convince people, and then help them understand that it's worth it to them even to go spend the money, if you will, to do it. So that's sometimes that's easier, sometimes it's harder. Sometimes something can move really fast, and sometimes it can take years. So I think it's just important to kind of see through all those different vantage points. But I have been really encouraged because I have seen a lot more implementer participation lately, And we've mentioned Safari a couple times already. Obviously, Chromium folks have been on this for a long time now because they really helped kick this thing into action. But I've been really happy to see Safari really stepping up and getting a lot more involved and doing some of the hard work here. And so that's all part of this process. So the implementers are ultimately, they kind of hold the key, right? Because if they don't implement it, we don't have it, right? And we can do a lot with polyfills, but we don't want to polyfill things that never are going to exist either, and then be dependent on what will then be a proprietary solution, right? And so there's all this back and forth and different things that kind of go into it. But I've been really encouraged by the implementers really embracing this and have enjoyed the interaction with them and the different perspectives. So
amazing.
Yeah, I think from just a developer's perspective, I kind of worry that we over rely on polyfills in some ways. So just from a declarative shadow DOM example, it seems like if you really want the best performance you can get out of it, you don't want to use a polyfill. So we were kind of waiting for the scales to tip. Not necessarily that we need all the browsers to support it, but the scales to tip in the right direction. And I think just the other quintessential example that comes to mind that I'm surprised wasn't brought up here was the is attribute to extend
Thank you.
built-in elements. So yeah, we don't have to go into the politics of what happened behind that, but there is one current holdout that seems like yeah, all the other implementers sort of agreed to it and have already added it to the browser, and there's just one holdout right now. And now, of course, Firefox is not holding out on declarative shadow DOM. Just to go back to the original example, they I think, have plans to implement it. But with I don't think it will happen in WebKit specifically. So,
I mean, I think we should get into this. It's an interesting one. I mean,
I think it's worth exploring. Yeah.
I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to Apple here. I mean, to bring this back to the polyfill case, this is something that comes up in the lit ecosystem a lot, where people ask for support for this, and we deny it. And it's not from a perf reason. It's just from we don't want to encourage components that will always require polyfills, right? Like our whole goal is to be native, and polyfills are okay temporarily, and they're okay on some browsers and not others temporarily. So we would have to then lit is a mix-in so that you can apply it to both the base HTML element, but also other native subclasses like HTML button element. And so we totally could do that, but we just don't even want to encourage people requiring some is polyfill. But on is specifically on the standards part, I think that Apple might be open to this. I think their position is kind of sometimes misrepresented a little bit. What they have said is that they really want it specified what it means to do things like, override connected callback or disconnected callback on native elements that have native behavior for connected and disconnected. And I think this is a reasonable ask. I mean, I think it turns out that maybe it doesn't matter. Chrome and Firefox have showed that if you just implement it, it does work. But there is likely a lot of unspecified behavior going on there. So, I think that eventually there might be some middle ground where, if Chrome and Firefox can say what they did in all these cases, then WebKit might be willing to, reconsider. So I don't know. I think this is an interesting case. Sometimes you get browser implementers who are very pedantic in a good way, not as a pejorative, right? This is what they need to do. They need to make specifications. They need to make things durable, because basically once it's in forever.
Yeah. Specs need to be really clear, right? Because it's not like a JavaScript framework, right? Once it's in the browser, it's there forever, and you need to be able to rely on it. There's real businesses, there's real people using it to get healthcare, for instance. They can't have it just break, right? So I get that. That makes a lot of sense. But I also see, I don't want to call them out, but WebKit doing things like changing the spec for declarative shadow DOM at the last minute, right? Things like that, where it just feels like I don't know when they're doing it accidentally or when they're doing it, for business reasons, right? And that's hard when there's a business associated with a browser, for instance. Same thing with using experimental features, right? It happens in JavaScript land, but then when that spec actually changes, then all of your users get broken, right? Like I personally building websites that people depend on, I cannot rely on that kind of stuff, right? So I get it. I see why they're a little slow, but at the same time, I have real use cases today, right? So wanting to write, for instance, a picture element that has custom element support inside of it, because there's only certain hierarchies of elements that can be put together. You can't do that, right? And that's a bummer, because a lot of things that we want to give to the users to make these new specs or these new elements more usable or easier to approach, we just cannot do without is. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a small glimmer of hope here, and I think it's important to understand like what the actual critique is. If anybody, you know, gets up the energy to want to try to like open up that, you know, that sliver and make it wider and see if we can actually get through it. You know, I would love to see, you know, I just don't know if the other browser vendors have enough bandwidth to kind of dive in to do that. But, you know, we have other like great interested parties who do awesome work on the web platform, Magalia, you know, places like that. Like if somebody was able to go in and kind of organize the critique and the solutions for it, like maybe we could get somewhere. So I don't know. There's also been some cross-pollination of employees between WebKit and other browser vendors recently, which, you know, I don't know. If you look at the is issue, you know, there are comments recently that make it seem like there's a little bit of hope. So I don't know. I'm not shutting the door on that completely myself.
I literally go to it once a day to make sure that it's still a no, because I need it for real world use cases. So I really hope you're right. I would love to see more comments on how we could make that move along.
Well, I think it's just it's important to recognize that like when the folks from WebKit were not wanting to move in that direction, it wasn't just because they didn't feel like it, right? There were some very legitimate concerns that they had. And if we as people asking for those features can't address those or can't, you know, give them the information that they need, specify the pieces that they need, then, you know, it just kind of sits there. And, you know, I'm also sympathetic to them as well, because if I recall, one of the issues was, you know, inheriting from built-ins, right? If we then have a bunch of folks inheriting from button, is it safe to change button or to add things to button in the future? Because that now affects downstream everyone that's ever inherited from button, right? And so now these are the kind of things that happen in native platforms and in programming languages as well. Anytime you want to add something, you've got to deal with the body of work that's out there. And so this, for example, significantly opens the door for those kinds of things to happen, where it might have been less in other cases. So it's just that there has to be a way to address that. Either, like Justin, like you were saying, maybe the way that it happens technically avoids some of that somehow, or maybe it doesn't actually inherit from it, but it just adopts certain known behaviors. But all this would have to be, those questions have to be answered in a way that I think would satisfy like WebKit, right? Before that they're going to take that on.
I think that's the difficult part, though, because like you know, sometimes you have you know, you have a question you want to answer, and there's a couple ways to look at this question and answer process. Like one is a very formal kind of almost, you know, scientific or legal kind of process where you're like, okay, I have, you know, proven that I have an answer to this, right? And the other is a more pragmatic kind of process where you say, you know, we have evidence that this isn't actually like an issue, or that we can, you know, logically reason that this issue here is equivalent to this other issue, and we've been able to work around that. So like the prototype inheritance issue, you know, this is something that's actually already present, right? Like anybody can put properties on any element, and we have, you know, Shmooshgate with array and things like that. People can already do this kind of stuff even without actual inheritance. And this is just something that the web platform like has to deal with. They had the issue with flat map and flat, and it's coming up again with it's always array. It's coming up again with some other array API.
There's too many methods of array. Let's remove arrays.
Yeah, maybe group or something like that. So it's like, yeah, web compat, you know, there's no versioning on the web. And, you know, people are always going to have to take any new API on any object, right? Like you could add a new global. You could add, like, let's say that Ben Lesh gets his wish and they add observables to the web platform. and they go to add a global observable like type in there, and that just breaks everyone. I don't know if that would happen that way, but like these things are just possible on the web, and as a pragmatic thing, you know, the platform has to always watch out for that. I don't know if that argument, you know, is suitable to everybody who works on the platform, who, you know, somebody in their own personal taste might say, no, I want to guarantee it won't be a problem. And then you have to deal with that, you know, issue there just for them.
You know, going on the same note, we all had the lovely time when Internet Explorer was alive and we're working and supporting. The main problem with the Internet Explorer from Microsoft was we can't change things because too many people rely on that. Like, you know, how many times have you supported Internet Explorer 8? And you're like, oh, should we just drop it out? You're like, you cannot, because there are these people that require that feature. They cannot upgrade. And it's the same here. So changes cannot just be made easily because they will affect so many people. And I did State of PWA a couple of months ago. Same discussion. Browser holding up, you know, Safari changing it, things are moving on. So unfortunately, you know, it's always a catching up situation where we want to move forward faster, and the browser catch up is the way of the web. Is the, you know, it is what we need to go around if we want everybody to be on the same note and the same functionality and feature to actually be around. So things are moving forward, and they're moving quite faster if you compare this year to the previous years. I guess maybe wrong, but that's the feeling from a user perspective, not from somebody.
Maybe if you're talking about CSS, but no.
This is going real fast.
Yeah,
but I mean, I don't think it's a question that things are moving too slow, at least not for me personally. Yeah. I like the iterative approach. I like that things aren't removed from the web platform. I like that things that I built 20 years ago still work in web browsers today. Like, what other software platform gives you that feature? The web is amazing in that regard.
Yeah. If you're okay, guys, I want to move away now I want to just move sideways. We looked at the browser. We discussed about the browser. There's another party that I think is also interesting for adoption. That is frameworks. So we've seen in the recent time that there's been a very big move in the industry of people going away from the JS heavy. So I'm a Vue.js developer. I love it, but there's this move away from, you know, JS only and really going for server side. We've seen Solid, we've seen Quick, we've seen a lot of that. We've seen Next and Nuxt now because they're taking shape. So the industry seems to be ready, moving that way. So it seems like it's a very great time for web components. You know, if I have to say the thing, is the time now because the industry is ready for removing the JavaScript excessive JavaScript from the page. But my question is very similar to what Nacho asked about the browser. How important are these frameworks for web component? Because I know that some of these frameworks use web component behind the scene, so they really help the adoption, and they can also do that what we were mentioning, the polyfilling parts. We can also do the slow adoption behind the scenes. So would you say that web component in the long run will be first-class citizen and be used by itself? Or would you say that the drive to web component will actually be driven by framework, you know, such as Lit, such as anything else that can actually be built on top of the web component?
I mean,
what's your take on that?
I feel like there's no reason to advocate your mastery of the platform, right, to a framework. There's no real reason to download multiple megabytes of JavaScript to do what is already built into the platform, right? I think some of these DSLs actually add complexity on top of what is actually pretty straightforward and performs really well if you write it by hand. And it isn't that hard. I think there's been a lot of FUD thrown around about how it's a big step back if you don't do DOM diffing, and you need the virtual DOM because it's the DOM is slow and the DOM is hard. And in all reality, it's really not. If you actually try to make something, web components do a really great job of encapsulating where your query selector is, for instance, and things that used to be really hard that just aren't anymore. And so I think frameworks have done a really good job of marketing to kind of like, oh, you need this, oh, you need this, oh, you need this.
That's a big one, yeah.
Yeah, and they've done a great job. It's been brilliant. The marketing has been amazing. I have no idea how they've done this for so long, but it's been really effective. And they've confused people into thinking that they're absolutely necessary, when in reality, they're doing more work and they're putting out worse websites that load slower and have spinners that just aren't necessary. So I think there will always be a need for frameworks for people's taste, right? And I think people, Lit has done an amazing job of bringing people who are on the way.js side of like, I need to write all this in JavaScript to like, actually maybe come back this way a little bit more. Like it looks kind of like React, but it actually does way better than React in reality. And I think, frameworks, I guess it's a style kit, whatever you want to call it, like Shoelace did an amazing job of papering over things like, Shadow DOM forms, etc. That was really hard to do, and it's getting easier now, right? So I think there's always going to be a place for frameworks to kind of bring people along that are a little bit more stubborn or a little bit more like set in their ways, beholden to a tribe, if you will. But I don't think in the long run they're going to be as necessary as they are today.
Yeah, I think that there will always be this notion of pace layers. So things that exist that move quickly and things that exist that move slower. And the platform has always moved slower than the framework space. And so I think that we'll always have both, and we should always encourage both. And I would really like to see both coexist. I would like to see the frameworkless use case taken into account at the specification level. And I would also like to see the framework case handled, because really, I think if you're introducing, just think of it from someone that's just coming brand new to web development. We're trying to teach them just from scratch. I think web components is a great place to start. And a frameworkless environment for web components would be a great place to start for them. And so, yeah, I would like to see that use case handled more at the specification level too.
Yeah, I think this is a question that could, take up like a panel discussion for hours, actually, right? Because, what's fascinating to me here is kind of the ecosystem dynamics, the kind of incentives and economy around this type of question about whether frameworks support web components. I think from a very basic level, you say like the web is, probably the most popular UI development platform in existence. And of course, a UI development platform should have a component model, right? Like if you came to this, like not, knowing about the history and how we got to this particular spot in web development, you would say like, that makes total sense. But I think frameworks have, often people who work on them or are rooting for them are in a position where they think that they have kind of this special position and a special right to exist in the ecosystem, and that they actually get kind of upset at the idea of the platform competing with frameworks. And this has actually been explicitly said by some of the framework leaders, even recently, that they, are resentful about web components for competing with their framework. And I think that this is, to me, it's very similar, like the way frameworks have kind of co-developed their kind of marketing stance. It's in a way they're very cooperative on a public face about the need for frameworks to exist, right? And they'll often say the same kind of things like, developer experience, performance, fixing the DOM, all kinds of things like that. And there'll be kind of like this kumbaya like presence out there where they're like, yes, all frameworks are great and all frameworks should exist, and web components are bad for like saying frameworks shouldn't exist or something like that. But then if you look at like the actual use of the frameworks and how the ecosystem breaks down, they actually don't cooperate on a code or ecosystem level, right? Like the frameworks are not compatible, they're not interoperable. And it's created this situation where when you start a project or when you're new to web development or whatever, the first decision you have to make is, what framework am I going to use? Mm-hmm. Right? It totally bifurcates segments the whole ecosystem in a way that makes it like, hard to learn, hard to move between projects, hard to move people and code between projects. And, web components does offer like, a path forward here if frameworks could, use them better and then kind of like accept that like, okay, things written in web components will work in my framework. Like that's actually an advantage, not a disadvantage. But I think because of this, like, we need to hold frameworks in this position of reverence, right? And that like they can't be competed with by something outside of frameworks, right? Like it's totally fine to create a new framework and say mine is better. Other framework authors will not be upset by that, right? But you can't say, we think you should be able to do web development without frameworks. People will get mad and say, you're crazy. Like, of course you need frameworks. I hope that more frameworks, like I hope there will be cracks in the dam here, basically. Like as niche frameworks or even bigger frameworks, like realize they need an ecosystem, they need components available for their framework, and that web components give them that, right? And if they build better web component support, then they can say, hey, Shoelace is a great, set of components to use along with my framework. And I personally think every framework that's not React should be 100% all in on web components. Like I think the biggest danger here is that React becomes such a fait accompli. It's totalizing, and it's like, well, what skill do I need to learn for web development? Well, I learned the skill that the jobs are requiring. Well, what skills do I require for the job? Well, I put the skills that most people, most candidates have. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy there where, even Angular and Vue can't hold up to React. Yeah. And Angular and Vue are like juggernauts, right? And if somebody makes a component library, what are they going to make that library compatible with? And so I think if we want to preserve the ability to have innovation on the web platform and have competition at the framework level that's actually viable, and not just like I did my weekend project in Solid or something because I think it's neat, but like I can't convince my company to use it. Like I think we need a way for these things to be interoperable, and we have that with web components. So I think like I don't know how many of the current frameworks are going to kind of realize that as a kind of ecosystem kind of leverage point that they have, but maybe new frameworks will come along and do that. And that's exactly why we have Lit, is to try to push on that and give people the DX that they expect on a framework level, but that's like 100% interoperable.
Yeah, I think the way I think about this is if somebody is asking me what should I build with, I like to start with can it be done with web standards? Please start there and see what the quote out of the box web experience is like. You might be surprised of just what you could do and how powerful it is. So if it's a greenfield project, right, something brand new, I absolutely think you can probably do whatever it is for a framework. If you go learn the actual standards, you can do it with web components. Probably there are probably a few exceptions, but you should at least start there and explore that. Can I do this with web components? And is there a library like Lit or Fast or something like that that maybe gives me that DX layer on top for web components, or helps me make a few decisions around how I'm going to build my web components, right? That accelerates me, right? I know the team we had at Microsoft, and I've got the sense from you too, Justin, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but when we were working on libraries for web components, our mindset was always like, we want to delete this code that we're writing. Like we're not seeing ourselves as building a web component library or web component framework. We are just seeing ourselves as maybe being one or two steps ahead of what's in the platform. And we wanted to push that into the platform and delete our code. And so we wanted there to be a very healthy kind of virtuous cycle between let us innovate up here, standards aligned innovation. As we learn from that, let's push that into the platform, delete our code, rinse and repeat, kind of a process. What I hope is that more of the frameworks out there will start to adopt that sort of a mentality. And Justin, I think like you said, I hope they'll see it as an advantage, as a selling point of their framework, is we have full support for web components, right? Whatever our templating or our binding language is, it works properly with web components or etc. So I hope that frameworks will see that opportunity for them, which also gives them an opportunity to be more active and in this process of building the platform itself, which is what I really think frameworks and libraries should be directed towards, right? So if you're building greenfield, I would say just look at the standards and ask yourself, can I just do this, right? Because it's quite, I mean, I was even surprised myself, and I was an architect for Microsoft's library, but the last couple of months I actually forced myself to go to Vanilla.js and I have been working entirely in Vanilla.js web components without even the library that I authored.
It's amazing, right?
And I, 3 years later, after having started that, I was even quite surprised myself about what I could do with very, very little code, right? And so I think, in my experience, again, when I was at Microsoft and we taught people, we didn't just teach our library, but we taught the standards, right? And so people were usually very happy and refreshed and very excited about that. So I usually just tell people, look at what the platform can do and start with that. And then if you need, then fill in, right? If you need something beyond that, what's just there, fill in, but do that very strategically, right? If you've got an existing application, then look about how you can use web components in the context of that existing framework, right? So because the reality is, today's frameworks will be around for a long time, right? There are millions of lines of code written in React and Vue and Angular and all this, right? So even if the platform had all those capabilities 100% built in and had the amazing DX and tools and everything was just, we could somehow say that it was perfect, millions of lines of code already exist, right? And that's not going to just be rewritten overnight, and some of it not ever. So I think what the thing is to look about how you can evolve your code base, right? Look about what are the opportunities to use web components within the context of what you've already got. And I think design systems, we talked about Shoelace. I think things like Shoelace and design system oriented stuff is like a very easy win in most cases to incorporate those within an existing framework code base. And then you get part of your code base that's now shareable, right? And then if you're working on top of a framework that just doesn't have great support with web components, go be a part of that framework's community and start advocating for that framework to have better support for web components. Because ultimately you're advocating for better support of the web platform. It'll be better for that framework. It's obviously better for you if you want it. It's better for us. So I would say approach it from different angles, depending on where you're at, what situation you're in. Starting something new, like give it a go with just pure web standards. You might be very, very surprised. And if you need a little bit more, you can layer lit on or fast or something like that. And then if you've got something pre-existing, just start to think about, oh, we've got to build this new thing. Could that be done with a web component? Or can we gradually move our design system over to web components? Or, oh, I found this issue with the framework. Let me go make sure that issue is actually tracked against that framework as a web component scenario that's not working the way it is. And I think that'll just be make the whole ecosystem a lot healthier, and also for people that are just working on apps or families of apps or whatever, it gives you a better path forward. One of the things that I just really love about web components when I'm trying to help people understand the advantages is the fact that they can be incrementally adopted. You do not have to rewrite your entire application to start using web components. And this is a huge, huge deal in these scenarios where there's, potentially millions of lines of existing JavaScript code built on some particular framework. And you don't have to throw that out. You don't have to rewrite it. You can start piece by piece, adding some of these things in, and you can start to reap the benefits that come from that, whether it's performance or whether it's, sharing of things, interoperability, et cetera. So I think also we need to help break people out of this mindset, of the framework mindset, where for 10 years it's been a change framework, rewrite my app, change framework, rewrite my app kind of a flow. That's not the case with web components, right? Nobody has to actually rewrite everything. Now you may choose to do that. There might be legitimate reasons for that. You want to evolve your code base over time and improve it, but there's no forcing function of now I must rewrite everything. I can just take a small little bit. I can even run an experiment in my app and say, well, let's see what this would be like if we built this little piece with web components. How would that work? And you can do that in a very low risk fashion from like an engineering perspective. Try it out. And then if it works, great. Do the next piece, then do the next piece or whatever. And that's the kind of thing you can do with web components that was very, very difficult. If you're on React and you want to experiment with Angular, that's going to be real, within the context of your React app, that's going to be really painful. It's not impossible, but there's so many downsides and so many challenges around that. It's probably not going to be good for your customers, even if you can make it work, right?
Double JavaScript.
Yeah, with web components, that's not the case, because you can even experiment completely vanilla in the context of your app with web components to try things out and to start moving things. And then as that body of web component code grows, then maybe you adopt something like Lit or something like that, because now maybe you've got enough sort of boilerplate or whatever that justifies bringing in a library, and you can very incrementally evolve things. And I think, as somebody that's talked to a lot of kind of C-level folks in different companies, from an engineering leadership perspective, this is really important, to be able to evolve your code base without the expensive rewrite, to be able to mitigate risk by being able to try something out, and being able to take advantage of new features without costly rewrites. I think this is a huge deal, and I hope people will start to think, who have existing code bases, I hope they'll start to think in those terms a little bit more as well, because it's not an all or nothing kind of a thing.
Yeah. You could, I think both Justin and Zach have.
I want to jump in on just one part. It's kind of a little bit of a tangent, but I want to make sure that we're not creating FUD here and saying that frameworks have awful web component support. Because in general,
I was going to say that.
Yeah, frameworks don't have a choice but to have at least minimally good web component support, because if they can make HTML, they can make web components. Like, they can instantiate web components. So in general, you can always put a web component in your frameworks template. There's really only one major framework that has problems with web components, which is being able to add arbitrary event listeners and being able to set properties on web components. And yeah, just to name names, that is React, and React has a patch in there. It has landed and is in their main branch, and you can turn it on with a flag, I think, to enable property and event listener support. And
there are solutions to that outside of React as well. So yeah, I didn't mean to construe it that way.
No, I mean, it's true. I've said the same phrase, but I think I'm referring to things like, one thing we really do in Lit is that there's no coupling. I think Fast does this too. There's absolutely no coupling between a parent component and a child component in terms of assuming that the child component is also Lit, right? So and we're very, very careful to hold this line, right? There's no advantage to having both the parent component and child component both be in Lit, right? Lit only assumes that your child elements are just elements. And that means there's, you can seamlessly migrate components, to and from Lit on either side without any breakage there. And that's the kind of thing I would like to see, some more frameworks out there adopt, right? It's like, yes, you can put a web component in there, but it has slightly different abilities than, say, the native platform component. And that's basically just not necessary. I mean, I think somebody's going to have some more philosophical enlightenment points about this, right? Like, a lot of people think there are special advantages to having, proprietary component model. And I don't think that's really true. But hopefully we'll see, Lit's one set of opinions. Lit tries to actually be as unopinionated as possible, but it necessarily is a set of opinions. I think Fast is the same. I would like to see more opinionated and maybe more far out there systems that, work with child components just via elements, but have some wild opinion on how you're supposed to do state management or, use state machines or some kind of, DSL or non-JavaScript thing or whatever, right? But then basically say it's cool, you can adopt this, experiment because everything is a web component. Everything is a custom element. But yeah, just to get back, all frameworks have pretty good web component support. Most of them score 100% on the custom elements everywhere website.
And which one doesn't? Just sorry. Go back
it would be.
I'm kidding. No, you don't need to say it.
So actually, well, it's funny. We added, just to show that it's not like dire or whatever, we added the React Nightly, which is kind of an unusual move for custom elements everywhere. It's usually the current version displayed on the site, but we have 2 entries for React. Right. One is the current production version of React, and the other is the nightly, so that you can see one gets 70% and the other one gets 100%.
But the next rewrite of your React app, you can add support for custom elements, and it looks like that's great.
If it ships. No, we've been waiting a couple of major versions for that to ship, so let's not let's not pretend like it is about to go up, because that has been
Which version of React, like the compiled one that gets shipped with Next, or like the other? I don't. Sorry.
whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah. Zach, did you want to complete? Did you want to add that? I know you.
I mean, I just wanted to reiterate that I'm just such a huge fan of the sort of planned obsolescence design pattern of framework authors. So that mentality of, we've developed a thing and we want to keep it as close to the platform as possible and use as many of the platform primitives as we can, and we be able to delete code, as Rob said later. And I really feel like that is the goal of a good framework. It should plan to be removed or merged into the platform at some point. And I really think that was sort of the leading design principle of jQuery back in the day, and I was a huge fan of that. I'd love to see more framework authors now just take that sort of leadership potential of driving your framework in that direction. I think that's a huge win.
Yeah. I gotta say, that is definitely like 100% what we're trying to do, but there is a little bit of a kind of uncomfortable nervousness I have with how describing the intention here. Because it's the conversation has been so charged. It's relatively easy to say we want to delete code over time, right? But given that you've presented a particular set of features in a particular DX, right? Like if you dig into what that means, right? Like how would lit delete code over time? You have things like DOM parts or template instantiation, which would let us kind of get rid of some of the guts of the lit HTML template library. But how far do you want to go, right? Like we have decorators for declarative reactive properties. Those rely on the existence of kind of a batched DOM update kind of life cycle that's in the base class. And then the template system isn't just the guts, it's also the surface syntax, the HTML tag template literal, and then some of the features like rendering arrays and whatnot. So one thing we don't talk about a lot, because I don't want to project like too much hubris here, because it doesn't come from that place at all. But I would love to see all the way to the Surface API, the things that we've built in Lit standardized, because we built them thinking about how could you possibly standardize something like this? What would it look like? Like, could there be an HTML element .html template tag that you could tear off and use for templates in JavaScript? Could the DOM do that? I hope. I actually think that it makes a lot of sense and is not too unopinionated. I mean, not too opinionated to layer something like that on top of template instantiation. Could the platform vend decorators to make reactive properties automatically? I think it could. Could the platform have a different base class that has the batched update lifecycle? I think it's going to need to, if we ever get to declarative custom elements. And I think declarative custom elements is the thing that would blow web components wide open, right?
That would change the fundamental nature of server-side frameworks as well. That's huge ramifications, right?
We run a real risk of doing the same. My biggest complaint about current JavaScript frameworks is that they're really brittle. I can't build real products on it without a huge team to maintain them, right? And if I have real users that have healthcare issues, for instance, they're trying to use a website I cannot in good faith ship only JavaScript solution, right? I need it to use best practices, which is progressive enhancement, etc., server-side rendering, right? So when I love what you're talking about there, Justin. I think using experimental features and like what you did with decorators is really interesting and really expressive. And you talk about DX a lot, and that's great. But it kind of puts web components in this experimental zone, right? Which can be dangerous, because people are like, oh, well, it's the same as React, or it's the same as whatever, it's experimental. And experimental is necessary, right? We need to be doing these experiments. We need to be playing with these things to kind of push things forward and show it's possible, right? And I totally agree with that. But experimental is interesting when you're talking about I built an experimental aircraft. You're a billionaire and you're going to fly over, your house, but not when you're building a jumbo.
I mean, I wouldn't call this experimental, right? The stuff is reliable. It works. It's software. It's well tested. I mean, things like YouTube and Photoshop for the web and Chrome itself, parts of it are built in, Polymer and Lit. I think that, using TypeScript's decorators, for us, TypeScript is optional. You can do plain JavaScript. But it's like another way to make a getter setter pair, right? Like this isn't like something that we don't know is going to be valuable or we don't know is going to work, right? Like it's fairly simple transform. TypeScript has the experimental flag for the current decorators. The new decorators do not have that. But that doesn't mean that the current decorators are like, we don't know certain things about them, like whether they work or how they work or whatever.
Right? Oh yeah, and to write it by hand isn't hard, right? But it's more just like, I don't want to give people the impression that the web components are not as stable, are just as unstable as some framework that came out today and is going to change tomorrow afternoon, right? So that's my only concern with them. I appreciate it. I think it's important. I love what you're able to show to people, but I worry that if they're like, oh well, this just broke, I had to rewrite my whole thing because of decorators changed. Like that's a bummer.
Yeah, and it's not true. I mean, there's two interesting conundrums here. One is kind of vanilla versus a library like lit or fast. And another is, getting people to understand what Rob was talking about earlier, this incremental adoption thing.
Yeah.
So we've had this issue, and it was really unfortunate. I don't think we realized how big it was going to be. But when we made lit, and we had Polymer originally, at first, when we made the lit HTML templating library, we're like, well, we're just going to make that an option to use on Polymer, right? But then we realized because we didn't have two-way data binding in lit, because we just use JavaScript and that's not available there, that we could cut out a lot of Polymer. And we're like, well, should we do that? Like, we could make this very incremental path where we add lit to Polymer and then slowly remove bits of Polymer and end up in a spot that has less code. And we're like, or it's web components. You can use any web component along with another web component. And so like, why don't we just make this more minimal, super lightweight lit only base class and let people incrementally migrate from Polymer to lit? And the problem is that people didn't understand that concept, right? They were like,
it's really common.
Oh, I have to rewrite my app from Polymer to lit. And if I'm going to do that, I might as well look at the whole framework space out there and see, like they viewed it as this big change and that lit was like a framework and Polymer was a framework. They didn't view it how we viewed it, which is like lit's just the next evolution. I actually think in a lot of ways we should have named lit like Polymer 4. That even just the name changed. So I think making people understand that you can have this interop, that it's natural, is a big thing to get over. Like you don't have to rewrite your app all the time.
Right.
It's huge. I mean, there's been 10 years, I think, of ingrained sort of training that we must rewrite to new framework, right? When it appears. So people don't even know that this is an option, right? And so you have to sort of untrain them and retrain them to think, really in a truly componentized way, right? Ideally, this is the way components really should work, right? And so you sort of have to, and again, you have also a lot of different people to help understand this too. You've got the engineers doing the actual work, right, that are used to their patterns and their habits and whatnot. But then you've also got people abstracted away, C-level folks and CTOs, et cetera, that don't really understand the technology at all sometimes. And it's just maybe acronym soup to them, but they've heard about this and they've heard about that. And so you have a completely different audience then to convince in a completely different way there. But I really feel like there's been a good solid 10 years of this sort of must rewrite mentality because there was no other way really. And now that's fundamentally changed. There is a different pathway.
Yeah. And I think it's, oh, sorry.
That's fine. You go ahead and then we'll.
Okay.
You go ahead.
There's a related issue too with vanilla versus library, right? Like I love the idea of people learning vanilla DOM APIs first, and then seeing what kind of help they could use, and then picking a library based on that. Unfortunately, I have a hard time recommending that as a practical course a lot of times because a lot of people get stuck at the point where they're like, I have to do all this stuff by hand. These APIs are terrible.
Feels like a step.
And they kind of don't realize the intention of the APIs is to, like, first establish the low-level capabilities, and now you can have, all these components that interop, and their implementation is encapsulated, and the implementation could be a library or could be vanilla. They never get past the point of, like, okay, I could choose a library like Litterfast or Stencil or something like that. And they're just like, well, these APIs are terrible. I'm done. I'm going back to React. And so sometimes, we made a conscious choice on the Lit homepage, actually. Like, we used to kind of talk about, like, here is what vanilla would look like, and then here's what Lit looks like. And so you can kind of tell what it does for you. And some of the feedback we got from users and people we asked to read this who didn't necessarily know web components is that, like, I just want to see what Lit does. What is it like working with Lit? Like, the web component part, the vanilla part looks ugly or boilerplate to me. And it's been very hard. Like, I want to advocate for vanilla, but I also want to advocate for, like, good DX out of the box and showing somebody right away how simple it can be. So I think, this is a thing we've talked about working on webcomponents.org and, a newer version of the documentation. And I think it's going to be really tricky there, because I think if you only stick to vanilla, you're going to make people think things have to be, more cumbersome than they do.
But this is the issue, right? Because people don't see what they don't know, right? And so they're like, oh, I like this DX, I like the way you write this DSL. It looks like something I'm used to, so I'm going to use that, right? But then they don't realize all the extra work they have to do, right? You still need to adhere to the event loop in order to make sure that your event listeners get rebound when things get re-rendered at a deeper level. You need to, like, adopt Lit whole hog in order to get the access to all the amazing DX, which is fine, because they're used to working that way, right? And I'm super happy with people moving from React to Lit, because it's way better as far as the amount of JavaScript, et cetera, and you're closer to getting on the platform. But I think there is maybe a step down where it's like you're still using, maybe there's a little bit of abstraction around, like, the instantiation, so the boilerplate is gone, like a minimal boilerplate removal, but you're still actually having the full power of DOM manipulation. You're not advocating that, like, that mastery to some framework, and you're actually knowing what's going on under the hood, so that if you get into a situation where, say, you want to use a shadow DOM element, but you have a form in it, like, how to actually do that by hand, and why it's what Lit's doing for you or what Stencil's doing for you. And you're not just like, oh, I need a framework to use web components because they suck, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of damned if you do, damned if you don't in there, where it's like, if you show vanilla, people think you need a lot of boilerplate. If you show the library, people don't understand that it's just helping you do the vanilla stuff that's already there. So, we really want people to understand both sides of this. And I think that's the challenge we have in education.
Big challenge.
Education.
Yeah, but I just want to say that if you have so I want to encourage just like a plurality of as many web components frameworks as we can have, because you could probably, 10, 15 different Lit size web components frameworks on the same page as one React library. I mean,
easily.
You can do so many different web components, interoperable web components on the same page. You wouldn't necessarily want to do that because you'd lose a lot of your performance benefit, but I just want to understand or convey the scale of difference between a web components library like Lit, for example, and the size of that versus the established norm, which is the React library, which is huge.
Yeah, it's hard to complain, right? It's like, oh, it's too much JavaScript, but you're like, but compared to what's normal, that's nothing, Yeah.
And there's something that you touched at the very, very start. When you touched at the very start was that with the framework comes all the buzz about it and the marketing campaign and the push. So when I was asking about, do you think framework will engage the web component, will push for it? What I was trying to say was precisely this: is if framework somehow, like you were saying, Zach, if more framework pop by and they're all web component based and it all looks kind of more like Lit, they're more kind of towards the web component instead than the JavaScript heavy, that will help to drive, because at the moment web component, I may be wrong, but doesn't have a strong voice, or the voice are all very small voices. So I would say that web components still needs a stronger voice, stronger advocate to push for it. And so far, what is done very well that in the industry was framework. So that was my question. It wasn't about how good the framework, but what can we do? What can the industry do to have a framework-like event for web components?
So this is also another damned if you do, damned if you don't, a little bit conundrum that we have, and something that, you know, I will admit to what we're doing on Lit is, you know, at some point, if you had like 15 equally used web component libraries, it would be a little bit hard for somebody to come along and say like there's a big success among them, even though I think the web components like proponents would say that is success. But for somebody else, they're like, okay, I want to look at an NPM chart and compare NPM downloads against, you know, something else, so that I can convince my boss that this is, you know, popular enough and reliable enough to use. And so, you know, I definitely see like just as a strategy for putting something out there that people can point to if they say, show me a web component success story, you know, we have apps we can point to. And, you know, to me, Lit is like a library we can point to and say like, listen, by raw numbers, Lit is doing well. It's comparative and better than a lot of, you know, on raw numbers than a lot of frameworks that have a lot of hype. And I think that's important right now, like kind of unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't think popularity is a very good judge of, you know, whether it's ready or not. I mean, it was popular to eat Tide Pods, right? Like you can't look at that, and I think it's really
yeah, but you can't convince people who care about popularity to not care about popularity.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah, like,
but that in itself is a marketing problem, right?
You'll be surprised. You'll be surprised how many people come to the company for us. Okay, they come with a sales pitch. They have no technical abilities. They just have an idea. They come around and say, "Hi, I got this idea, and I want to build it in React." And you go,
"Right?
Do you know what is React?"
Yeah. Well, why? I
was talking to this guy. Told me this is cool. I said, "You have no idea if React is good for you." So we go back to that it's going to be hard to sell that guy Lit or plain web component because it's going to be a big sell. The guy thinks the React is cool, and it goes, sorry for Zach that I don't know who was talking. It was Nacho.
I was thinking, do you think there's like uninformed criticism or outdated probably, or just plainly wrong? Because there are, I don't know, like louder voices, or like you said, it's a marketing thing that affects how people sees web components. And if there's some criticisms that you think that it's completely wrong that you've heard or you hear a lot, what would be it? Or how can we change that vision of web components? Like,
how much time do we have left?
Just pick one, please, if you can, because I don't know. I've heard lots of stuff, and somebody's like, "That's not true."
Yeah, there's so much fun. It's so hard. It's so hard. You know, I heard one the other day again, and you know, someone who matters is going around saying that you can't use web components as SVG, and it's like they're describing one use case. It's like one use case. You can't extend an SVG element. Like, okay, cool, you can. But you could embed SVGs, like, you know, the enhanced.dev web marketing site, like landing page, is like all SVG. So the fact that people think that you can't use them with web components is just not true, right? But it's really hard to fight these cult of personalities. It's impossible, honestly. And I actually think we're at the point where I don't want to do it anymore, right? I don't want to try and convince people who are, you know, completely beholden to someone popular to think differently or to even look at it objectively, right? So I don't know. I think it's really hard right now. We have a marketing issue. Web Components has a marketing issue. I think we've seen some really big companies, Microsoft and Google, adopt it like whole hog, and still are having a hard time convincing people to, you know, stop kicking themselves in the face. So it's like, I don't know. It's hard.
I wonder if we need almost some sort of, sorry, I'm just going to idea guy in here, but if we need some sort of just marketing moment, like HTML5 had this sort of marketing moment where it was a group of web standards and they sort of drew this line in the sand, and this is the marketing brand of the new platform moving forward. And I wonder if Web Components almost needs that same just moment in time.
It's hard. It's hard because, like, as you know, I like to think of myself as a scientist, right? I like to look at data and be like, better, yes, no. Have a hypothesis, prove it or disprove it, right? Have a use case, come up with the best tool for the job, right? But I'm not seeing that in public. And honestly, when I like bring up things like data, people get upset. And I don't know. I'm at a loss. I think we need I've said this a couple of times, like, I feel like we need a coalition of people who are, you know, working together to try and just build a bunch of things. And like, hey, look, this works. It's the best practices. It's the fastest. It's like, you know, objectively better in every way. And I don't think we can do it as individual frameworks. I think that it has to be a big movement together, and I don't know what that looks like, right?
Well, we have some bit of start at trying to get this together with the Web Components community group, and I think that that is the most likely vehicle for trying to put together some of this stuff. And I think that one thing that hasn't gone well recently is I think that participation in that I think has been really hit by layoffs and belt tightening at a lot of companies, right? Layoffs at Google, Microsoft, and Facebook, and just all these companies. Shopify, who released some web components recently. Salesforce, like everybody's been hit, and so nobody has kind of extra time to like kind of donate to these efforts. I'm hoping that like things loosen up and get a little bit better there, because I think that's our vehicle for creating some shared branding, throwing a conference, advancing the community protocols, so that things that the standards don't take care of can be done in an interoperable way.
Yeah, it feels like a communication issue, honestly. I think this for normal people, like trying to read a spec is impenetrable, right? They're not going to go to the spec and try and read it. Like they're going to get halfway through and be like, okay, cool, but what does that mean? Like how do I use this now? And I think we have a really big issue in that it's unclear even to people like me who like do this every day. Like, what can I use today? What can I use right now? I'm building real things right now. What can I use? And then you're like, oh, like I go to a framework's website. I'm like, oh, you can use all these things. Great. I start using it. I'm like, oh, but that's all JavaScript. Like, what if I want to do progressive enhancement? What if I want to like render HTML and then like enhance it? Like, what can I do today? And the answer is, well, it depends on which browser you use, right? And like, that's a bummer. I can't do
too many blockers.
Yeah, and I can't do the senior web developer thing with my client, right? Like I can't be like, well, it depends, right? You just can't. You just can't.
And imagine the junior who want to start development right today. Goes in, he writes 100 days of code. How do I start? We cannot go around some of those. So that's the problem. We need to remove some of those blockers for sure.
Right. And there are standards that are here, like that work amazing, that are way better than anything that's like written in JavaScript land that you can use right now that we're not really talking about because we have this brilliant idea of what the future will be, right? Of like, but when it's all there, this is what we can do, and that's amazing. And I think that vision is good, and I think that when we get there, it'll be the best thing to ever happen. But we're just not quite there, and we've been like so close to being right there for so long that people are getting burnt out, right? And like, I want to avoid people getting burnt out. I want to kind of like take it a step back. Be like, okay, cool. This is the vision. These are all the specs that are going towards it, and they're great and they're brilliant.
These results on search.
Oh my goodness.
But I mean, I really appreciate Rob for this too. Rob's written a couple of great blog posts recently that kind of like go through a lot of the recent and future specs and where they are and how that ties together in a vision.
I kind of saw this as absolutely as a communication problem, and I thought to myself, well, the very least I could do is just like write some blog posts. So I've been trying to be relatively consistent about getting some of the information out of the, sort of the spec land and community group meetings into like a format that people who are interested can read. And the whole myths and I have a myths and misconceptions blog post because I was just exhausted from having to readdress the same incorrect information, right? So now I just send the link to people, right? And so that was partially for my own sanity, but also to really just help what is a real problem. There's an image problem that we have. And so I think putting out positively, having people put out more quality content, instructing people, helping people understand what is possible, connecting the dots between things too, because that's the other problem, right? The web is built iteratively, which is fantastic, and it's the only way to practically do it, right? But then sometimes in the midst of that, we miss what are obvious connections between these things that were shipped incrementally. Because at a certain point in time, those pieces actually, the stars sort of align and something, bigger than the sum of the parts, if you will, happens, right? And so I think of things like container queries that have landed. Combining container queries with web components is a huge awesome thing, right? And so like, but those are sort of independent, right? I mean, they are independent, right? But when you bring them together, then that also makes the story of a true component model even richer. And so I think we need to start telling some of those kinds of stories, just connecting the dots for people, getting more good quality content out there. And then I'm with Justin too. I think we need to find a way to bring, you know, the official website of Web Components back up in a kind of new and improved way, and really rally people around, that, and around some efforts for visibility. And it is a very tricky situation. But for myself, I'm just trying to write more content, you know, in the meantime, because it's even great for me too. Even though I've worked with this stuff for years, sometimes a blog post is even handy for me as a reference to myself, you know, later on, right? So, you know, hopefully things like that can help.
But there is a valid criticism right now that I do want to point out, and it's that I think people go to use React or Solid or, you know, these ones for state management, right? They're like, how do I do state management in my component model? I'm not, you know, components are great, and I think a lot of the frameworks and web component frameworks really nail the component, but then how do they all work together starts being this issue that people just can't get over, right? They're like, oh, but I have this in here, and normally I would just install Redux, but I can't do that with web components, therefore web components suck, and I'm going back to React.
Oh, but you can.
I mean, but you can, but it's one of those things that they don't get to that point, right? You know, like I want to do use state inside my lit element, and like I'm sure there's some adapter or whatever that you could write for that, but they want the whole thing, right? I think most people don't go and get a component. Like maybe they make a little test bed and they make a couple components and they're like, oh, that's cool. And then they go to make an actual application and they're lost, right? And so that was something that we tried to fix with Enhance, is just like, okay, cool. Like here's your little application. You know, if you're used to just writing create React app over and over and over again, and you actually don't know all the parts that go into it anymore, or don't want to even keep up with it anymore because they change all the time. This is something that you can use for the state management part. And I think that I would love to see more, I guess, whole applications. I know that there was some made, like for instance, Photoshop on the web was made and they had to handle state management, right? But none of that trickled down to the users.
It did actually. Adobe uses MobX, and so they published a lit MobX mixin, and it's actually only like a dozen lines of code.
Nice.
But you know, once you add that to your class, then any MobX objects you use in your render method will just cause your component to re-render.
That's sweet.
Like just seamlessly. So like, yeah, Adobe, I mean, they have unique requirements because like actually all their state isn't like a WASM C++ bundle for your actual like photo. And they have like weird ways of piping that in and out, which would never be applicable to anybody else. But they did get the MobX piece out there.
Oh, that's great.
And I think it's kind of an ecosystem issue too, because like React doesn't include state management really, right? Like useState is just a reactive property. It's just a class property in a weird API. But you know, in React, you still have to, you know, install Redux or MobX or Recoil or, you know, whatever the state management system of the day is. And that is what you have to do often in a lot of our web component libraries. I think the issue is that like React's ecosystem is so big that the subset that's the Redux ecosystem is also big.
Correct.
Yeah. Right. And so like, we need to like publicize more of the solutions that are out there so people can find them, or, you know, help communities kind of coalesce around these things.
Yeah, I do think.
I think it's not just.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just think that full solutions would help a lot. You know, like this is how you do that. You know.
Yeah, it's hard because like you have to be. Sorry, Rob. Well, you have to be opinionated. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was going to say it's hard because you have like. On one hand, we're trying to be like as unopinionated as possible, right? Deliver the DX and performance in the most kind of vanilla-ish way we can. But once you get, you know, you go up the stack towards an app and you have more and more opinions that you need to, you know, take, right? Which state management system do you use? Which router do you use? You know, what kind of component set do you pre-populate your thing with? And it becomes less of a like, you know, here's like in our case, like, a lit application framework wouldn't really just be a lit application framework. By the way, I've wanted to make lit AF forever, but we'll never do that. But, it would be a lit application framework with this set of choices. And I actually think that's probably like a different thing.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like Next and React are different.
Correct.
But I think that's kind of the issue here is that we could have, 20, 40 different kind of app starting points that all have different sets of choices in there.
Well, and it's also, that's dangerous, right? I mean, at Begin, we made a bunch of starter apps and we used all the newest, frameworks and all the newest state management tools. And those things broke every single day. Like that was my full-time job for a year, 2 years, just keeping those working. And so I think that there actually needs to be a more generic answer for this, right? Something that's not, using MobX with lit, in an opinionated way. I think it's something more like, how do you do state management in general with web components, right? Like a best practice, if it were to come out.
Well, I think it's even more than that, because it's not just the technology choice to use for state management, but it's really, and there's hardly any literature out there on this, right? It's how do you scale that? What are the patterns and the architectural considerations for state management at scale? This is not unique to web components at all. I done consulting for many years, and I consulted on very large scale React code bases as well, with hundreds of thousands or millions of lines of code, and they were utter state management disasters, right? Using quote Redux or using quote whatever tech that they were using, it didn't matter, because there was a deeper set of architectural approaches that needed to be folded in there to use the technology right, whether it was the right technology or not, right? Because something like MobX is also very, very different from Redux, right? They have very different, sort of capabilities and patterns and performance characteristics and all these different things. And so it's like, helping people to look at their app, what they're trying to build, find the right piece of technology that aligns with the kind of thing they're building, and then helping them to use it right. And a little to-do app example does not teach people how to build something that is a 300,000 line app. Or when we were at Microsoft, right, it was like I was looking at Office, right, which is something like 8 million lines of code, right? And so the patterns and the architectural practices and things that you do at that scale, what you read in the average blog post on one of these state management solutions, if you try to do that at that scale, you will fail. Like you will utterly destroy the app. And there isn't a lot of good writing and literature on that. So I think we have to, this is such a huge issue. One of the things we did different with Fast is we built in a signal-based reactivity system from the beginning, because it was an opinion that we took, and we wanted that tool for scaling things out, right? And so, but I had a whole bunch of specific experience around why I wanted to do that. And also, not just that, but when I train people, I train them how to use it in a very particular way, right? And that's the kind of stuff that's also missing as well. So I think we have to.
You're saying
we really have to train people somehow in something that is beyond the junior level task, because the majority of the content out on the web, whether it's React, Vue, whatever, is actually relatively like beginner level material, right? And those patterns do not scale to larger apps. They just don't. And that's where people have a lot of hard learned lessons, and unpleasant things happen. So I don't know. It's a big issue.
There are many big apps, huge apps out there built with that. They got no problem. So let's not completely destroy the world and destroy the framework as it is. So frameworks are there, worked okay, and there are huge apps out there. So we cannot say that they don't. They do, but you're right. There is not enough content to also share how to do web components. So that's 100%. The content things is there. Apologies, I took over the mic because it's 2 minutes left, and I want to finish off in a big thing. So anything else? Did you want to finish that off, Rob? Apologies for just jumping.
Oh, no, that was the thought. I really think we need to help our engineering community grow in maturity around architecture and decision making and how to scale things, beyond.
So usually we do an around the room as a last question. We go 1 minute. So it's going to be fast, okay? So you need to be very fast. What we usually ask is, it goes really well with this conversation, but this is something that we do on all the state office. If people want to get started, what site? Where should they go? What do you suggest? So if you do have 1 or 2 resources, just shout them out. It will really help all the people. If you notice the chat, all the people are there. How do I get started? Where are the resources? So around the room, I'll start from the top and go down. So I don't forget. Chris.
Oh, I honestly start with MDN. MDN Docs is the best place to start. It has the most comprehensive coverage of the specs, as well as like how to get started, and then it goes on to some more advanced parts. And then I would say go into enhanced.dev and play with an actual application.
Justin.
I'm going to give a very similar answer. MDN has the web APIs subsection / web components, and it gives an overview. I think that's actually maybe too drilled in for a lot of people. So I wish I could say webcomponents.org would be the place to go to, but it's a little bit kind of old these days. So I'm also going to pitch like lit.dev as a very easy way to kind of get started. And we have an interactive playground, so you can write components right there in your browser. Yeah, if you pair those together, should be pretty good.
That's good. MDN is the way. Zach.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say just a little bit more specifically into MDN is just write a custom element. Start out from scratch with just a vanilla custom element and see how far you can go with it. And I think that the second part of the question is that it feels like this is maybe an unanswered question. We don't have a great answer for this. Like we have individual framework recommendations, like Lit is great, Enhance is great, WebC, the thing I built, I'm sure is amazing. But yeah, I really don't think we have a great just start web components from scratch resource for folks. And I wish that one would exist. So if someone's interested in making that, I would definitely promote it.
I've actually added it in our marketing tool. While we were talking, I wrote in the chat, we need to do a full end-to-end. We've got a website called starter.dev. So I added it up to do actually one that is completely web component. And I think so.
And I'll put a pitch for people to join the Web Components community group, and hopefully we can start up the webcomponents.org effort again. Yeah.
Rob, take the show. Last thoughts.
Yeah. Definitely agree with everything that's been listed. MDN and the lit docs, the fast docs, even though they're library specific, you will learn a ton of web standard stuff along the way. So they're great places to be looking. If I can promote myself a little bit, follow my blog, please. I'm trying to write a lot about web components, and I actually have several sort of introductory to vanilla web components stuff there, both making the case for web components and build your first web component. So that's Eisenberg Effect on Medium, medium.com, and I've got a lot of content planned around web components there. And I'll squeeze one more thing in, which is that I'm working on a pretty comprehensive course on web components. It's not ready yet, but and one of the things that we'll do that's a little bit different is during the course of that, we will build a micro library that is a little bit like Lit, a little bit like Fast, so that you see a little bit of what those libraries also do for you, and you get an understanding of the underpinnings of that along the way. So it's vanilla, but a little bit of a different twist there. So hopefully keep an eye out for that. I hope that'll be something really special when it's available.
I got the name for you, Fastlit. Sorry. Looks apart. It's been fantastic to have you around, guys. We had a very, very active chat as well. So people were really listening and liking this conversation. Went in, we didn't follow all the questions. That is great. It means that the conversation just flow organically, so it's great. And with that, I say goodbye to all the listeners. And thanks so much as well, Nacho, for being my host, my co-host.
Thank you to all the guests. It's been very informative.
Okay.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Keep up the great work. You guys are doing such amazing things. It's really fun to watch and follow along. Appreciate you all.